Okay, well, welcome to this makeup lecture, which it appears no one has been able to make. But I will still give the lecture and I'll put up the recording in case anyone wants to see that. So, um, I'm going to start with what I didn't get to talk about at the end last time, which is the modern philosophy. Right? Remember, Hume um, divides the philosophical view that is the double object view, that there's a representation in us and an object outside of us. He divides that into two different kinds. One is the ancient philosophy. I didn't assign that part this year, and the other is the modern philosophy. Um, Now, I mean, he's already criticized the philosophical view in general as an irrational response to the problems with the vulgar view, right? The vulgar view was that our um, uh, objects are not distinct from our impressions. So uh, when I see the table, the immediate object of my mind is the table. Um, but Hume says the vulgar also believe that the table exists even when they're not sensing it, and that the table exists independently of their mind. And that means they think the very impressions of their mind exist even when they're not present to their mind. Um, and they think the very impressions of their mind are independent of their mind. They can exist on their own. Um, and Hume says we can tell that that follows from claiming they have a continued existence, but we can tell it's certainly false because what objects we see depends on what we do to ourselves. Like, for example, when I touch my eyeball, now I see two of everything. So at least one of them wasn't there before and was caused by something happening to me. But from like effects, we conclude to like causes. So if that image, which looks just the same as a regular visual image, was not independent of me, I should conclude that none of them are. And the philosophical view is it so the rational response to that, that is the response that's in line with the usual regular way of reasoning from cause and effect, is to say, um, oh, so I guess there isn't something that has a continued and distinct existence. There's just my impression and it exists when I'm having it. That would be roughly speaking Berkeley's view. But Hume says, I mean, there's another part to Berkeley's view that mainly that my impression is caused by an external object, which doesn't resemble it. But I'm not talking about that now. Um, so instead of doing that, though, the philosophers respond by saying, oh, so there is something continued and distinct, but it's not the same as my impression. It's something that I sense, that I'm in relation to, that I refer to by means of my impression. And that's essentially Locke's double object view that we discussed in the whole first part of the course. Um, and uh, and the modern philosophy version of it is more or less supposed to be Locke. I mean, it's not only Locke, but it's not the version he discussed isn't exactly Locke's, but it's um, it's essentially Locke's view, and with variations, is held in common by lots of other early modern people. Um, And so the modern philosophy involves this distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities. And strictly speaking, a quality, remember, is a power in the external object, but it's a power to cause a sensation or what Hume will call an impression in me. So the modern philosophers think that the external, I have impressions because the external objects have the power to cause impressions in me. Um, but not all of those impressions resemble the external object. Um, the primary, the impressions caused by the primary qualities resemble their object, whereas the impressions caused by the secondary qualities don't resemble their object. And remember, those primary qualities are the qualities that bodies have just by virtue of being bodies: bulk, figure, extension, motion, solidity. Hume also adds cohesion and gravity, which Locke would not. It doesn't make that much difference if you add those to the list or not in this context, anyway. So, those are the primary qualities. The secondary qualities is everything else, namely most of what we usually call sensible qualities: color, smell, taste, sound, sort of, heat and cold. Um, so Hume gives an argument which he attributes to these modern philosophers as like why they think the secondary qualities can't resemble anything in the object. And then the way their argument then goes is, like in every version of the philosophical view, they think the objects cause certain impressions in us that resemble them. But now they're going to eliminate the ones that they've shown don't resemble the object, and will be left with the ones that do resemble the object, namely the sensations caused by the primary qualities. So the argument Hume gives for the argument for the modern philosophy in particular is going to be the argument against the secondary qualities resembling the external object. And the argument, Hume says they make a lot of arguments about this, but this is the only one I find convincing. And it basically works like this. So the same object, without apparently changing, can give rise to two different sensible qualities. So here's the object. Now, like Locke's example is that it's water, and I put one hand in it and it feels warm, and I put the other hand in it and it feels cold. Because my two hands have been in different places before this, right? So one, I heated up one hand and I cooled down the other, and then I put them both in the same water. And to the hand that's been cooled down, the water feels warm, but to the hand that was heated up, it feels cool. So without apparently changing means, I mean, of course, it does appear to change to the two hands. But I guess it means to the rest of my senses, it doesn't appear to change, or there don't appear to be any changes, causes that would account for a change, right? Like this is the same water, it's all connected. We know from experience, except in this situation, that when water is all connected, it feels the same temperature. Um, I mean, there's something a little weird there about without apparently changing. But in any case, I mean, you can see in the example that that's what we think, right? Like we don't think that it's because the water is different temperatures where one hand is, a different temperature where one hand is and where the other hand is. We think nothing has changed from here to here. And of course, you can imagine doing it one after another instead. Nothing has changed from this time to that time. And yet the water gives two different impressions. That is, impressions of two different sensible qualities, or as if of two different sensible qualities. Uh, so that's step one. The step two is that, on the other hand, it's impossible for it to really have two different sensible qualities. Um, why is it impossible? If we assume that it hasn't changed from one part to another or from one time to another, and if we assume that something can't have two different, well, not just any difference, right? Two mutually exclusive sensible qualities at the same time, like hot and cold or red and green. Um, if we assume that it can't do that and there's been no change, so since there's been no change, if, you know, since there's no change from here to here, if it's hot here, it's also hot here, but it's cold here. So that would mean it's hot and cold at the same time. And, it would also be cold here, right? And it can't be hot and cold at the same time. I mean, how do we know that exactly? From experience, I guess, according to Hume. So this is all reasoning about cause and effect. Um, so from experience, we know that's impossible. And therefore, um, some impressions don't resemble the quality in the body that caused them, right? Because these two impressions here, right, the heat impression and the cold impression, don't resemble each other. And the body can't have both of these qualities. It has to only have one of them. Or anyway, it has to have only one quality anywhere, everywhere. And so if this one resembles it, this one doesn't, and vice versa. So we have at least one impression of a secondary quality that doesn't resemble its cause. But again, the same principle. From like effects, we infer like causes, right? That is, it would be irrational. That is, it would go against the usual rules of cause and effect reasoning to take two impressions that feel on equal terms with each other, right? I mean, uh, um, they both feel like perfectly normal impressions of temperature. To take those two and say, oh, yeah, one of them was caused by a quality in its object and the other one wasn't. So if that, or sorry, one of them resembles a quality in the object, was caused by a quality that resembles it, and the other one wasn't. Um, so in other words, once we decide that at least one of them doesn't resemble its quality, we have, I guess, at least we have no reason to think the other one resembles its quality. Maybe it's stronger than that. We should think the other one doesn't resemble, we should think that neither of them resemble the quality. Therefore, no impressions resemble equality because they're all on the same footing here. So you could doubt that too. Are they really all on the same footing? But okay. So, um, I mean, there's some complications here, right? Like Berkeley says about this same argument, says that it doesn't properly show that the body doesn't have a temperature. It just shows that we never know what it is from our impressions. It could still have a temperature. Uh, that is, it could still resemble some possible impression of heat and cold, I guess. Um, I mean, I have a thought about how Hume would respond to that. Um, but I'm not sure it's right. But he could say these impressions have nothing in common, right? So like they're two separate impressions, just like two different colors. Um, they have nothing in common. There's no necessary connection between them. So when I try to think the body has some temperature, I don't really have an idea corresponding to that thought. That would have to be an idea of temperature in general, that is, of what's in common to all the temperature impressions. Now, I mean, remember when Locke talked about what's in common to all the color impressions, he said they're the ones we receive by only by sight. Um, right. So for Locke, it makes sense to say, um, therefore they have something in common because um, they all have um, effects on us by the same pathway, by our eyes, something like that. Hume is on the at least on the road to proving that we don't know about anything like that. Um, so that is that we can't classify impressions according to the way they're caused in us. Um, All right. Anyway, that's as much as I want to say about that. The main thing is, this Hume thinks that this argument is good, and he attributes it to the modern philosophers. So he says, sure enough, they're right. Our impressions of secondary qualities couldn't resemble their object. Um, Now, I mean, at this point, Berkeley says, but the primary qualities are just like the secondary qualities. Right? He says, uh, just as the water feels different temperatures to two different hands, the same tower looks round and square from different distances. Um, but uh, I think Hume is, I mean, at least Hume doesn't give that answer, right? And I mean, he's read it in Berkeley. He doesn't talk about Berkeley that often, but he does sometimes. He's definitely read it. Um, I think presumably because he notices what I pointed out when Berkeley said that, which is that Locke probably thinks of the primary qualities as tangible qualities. So you would have to claim that the same tower feels round and square at the same time. And perhaps that doesn't happen. I mean, there are haptic illusions. Uh, there's one that people have talked about since ancient times that Hume definitely, in fact, does Hume himself mention this? Like where you kind of twist your fingers together and then you feel two things where there's actually one or something like that. Um, but maybe, yeah, I don't know. In any case, that's not Hume's answer. Hume's answer, in a sense, is much stronger than that, though. Because rather than saying, and the primary qualities are just like that, he says, if you take the secondary qualities away, the primary qualities are not enough to make a body conceivable. That is, if we try to conceive of something that resembles our ideas of primary qualities, but not any of our ideas of secondary qualities, and in particular, not our color impressions. If we try to form if we try to form the idea of a body that has no color, it turns out that we can't do that, according to Hume. So therefore, when we think that only the primary qualities resemble something, or any only the impressions of primary qualities resemble something in the object, we don't know what we're thinking. We can't imagine that. Um, So, like to show this, and at this point, Hume doesn't bring back coherence and gravity at this point. So I think he also agrees they're not very important. He goes through basically a list of the other primary qualities, or at least some of them. So he says that, first of all, start with motion. So motion is one of the primary qualities, but Hume says everyone will agree that we can't conceive motion without extension. I guess really he should say disposition to extension, right? Because according to him, I guess simple things that aren't extended could move. Um, but those simple things are things that have a position and are capable of extension by being added to something else. So, for short, right, motion can't be conceived without extension. Um, I think this is an example of Hume's, like, where does that come from? That sounds like a necessary connection between distinct ideas. In fact, that's the very kind of thing that Locke will say is, he may even give that example somewhere, that Locke will say is due to our perceiving necessary connections between ideas of different primary qualities. Hume thinks there aren't necessary connections like that and can't be that we perceive. So, how can it be that we can't conceive of motion without extension? Well, I think it's because if you remember when he was discussing the possibility of a vacuum, he said that motion is basically the same thing as creation and annihilation, right? That is, motion means something was here at one time and then at another time, it was no longer there, but instead it was here. So it's basically like as if something were annihilated here and created over here. So motion is basically a negation, right? It has to do with something not being where it was before. What not being where it was before. And this is like Hume's general rule is that negation um, can't be conceived without the idea of something negated. I mean, the thing appearing here, you might say that's not negation. It's created, not annihilated, but it still involves negation because it means it's here now, even though it wasn't there before, right? So the idea of A moving involves the idea of not A, and I can't have an idea of not A without some positive idea of A. So to have the idea of something moving, I have to have the idea of something that takes up a certain space first and then doesn't. So the idea of motion depends on the underlying idea of extension. That's step one. So motion requires extension. That is, I can't have the idea of motion without the idea of extension. But he says, I already proved in my discussion of space that I can't have the idea of extension, or I could add in again something simple that can make up a part of extension. I can't have those ideas without an idea of color or solidity. So my idea of something moving or extended is my idea of something that's colored and moving and extend or extended, or something that's solid and moving or extended. I mean, that is, if it's moving, it's extended. It can be extended without moving, obviously. So, um, um, and his proof of that worked in a similar way, right? Like um, if all we know about something is that it's not extended, then it's nothing. It has to have some other quality besides being not extended, and that's either color or solidity. So, um, um, the color is a secondary quality. And I'm supposed to be forming an idea of something that has only the primary qualities and no secondary qualities. So therefore, if I'm thinking of something moving or extended, I'm thinking of something that's solid. And then Hume says, but what is the idea of solidity? And remember, solidity is just the thing that Locke is supplies here, right? That is, Descartes said we only needed these. I mean, he's not bringing in bulk and figure, but I think he takes it as obvious that bulk and figure also depend on extension in the same way, right? To be a have a figure is to have a limit to your extension, and to have a bulk is to have a quantity to your extension. So it's so bulk and figure also depend on extension. So Descartes thought that that's all we have. That's the concept of a body. And Locke says, well, that's not the concept of anything. There's no difference between a body and empty space. Therefore, there's no difference between one body and another. Therefore, there's no such thing as motion, etc. Um, so solidity is what Locke thinks is going to save him from that. Solidity as a primary quality. But Hume says, and this is um, book one, part four, section four on page 277. It's in the ninth paragraph. Um, the idea of solidity is that of two objects, which being impelled by the utmost force, cannot penetrate each other, but still maintain a separate and distinct existence. Solidity, therefore, is perfectly incomprehensible alone without the conception of some bodies which are solid and maintain this separate and distinct existence. So again, solidity, Hume is saying, is basically a negative quality, right? It means that this body won't penetrate into this one. Oops. It means this body won't penetrate into this one. But I have to already have some idea of a difference between these bodies, right? Like I have to know what this body is and, and what this body is in order to conceive, in order to think that this one can't be in this one. If they're both the same, other than solidity, then I'm thinking something can't go into something, but I have no idea of the something. So it's inconceivable. So it's like it's the same principle throughout here. It's about that something purely a purely negative um um an object that's purely negatively determined is not conceivable. There has to be something to be um, negated, limited, right? This again, this is like a limitation, right? It's saying that whatever this body is, it can't go over this line. But I have to know what this body is before I can think of it as limited by this line. And Hume says, since we've already ruled out color, there's nothing left. And therefore, these supposed bodies are inconceivable. We have no idea of them. And so the modern philosophy, in a sense, it's worse off than the vulgar view or the ancient philosophy because um, it's not only false or like demonstrably false or uh, silly and extravagant. Um, it's literally incomprehensible. This couldn't be true because there's nothing to be true. We don't understand what someone is saying when they say this. Um, Now, I mean, that definition of solidity, however, is not exactly the same as Locke's. So remember, Hume's definition, the idea of solidity is that of two objects which, being impelled by the utmost force, cannot penetrate each other. Whereas Locke says that the idea of solidity, so, and by the way, this is in the essay, book two, chapter 4, section 6, arises from the insurmountable resistance that we find in body, which I guess I've added the word insurmountable there, arises from the resistance that we find in body. The resistance that we find in body means, as Locke also says there, like if I hold a football between my hands, I can't put them together. The body resists me. So solidity is an impression I get when a body resists me. But Hume says, and this is on page 279, so it's just a little bit farther on from what I was reading before. The impressions of touch are simple impressions, except when considered with regard to their extension, which makes nothing to the present purpose. And from this simplicity I infer that they neither represent solidity nor any real object. So, and then he goes on to discuss various cases to try to show why they couldn't represent solidity or any real object. So, I mean, it's confusing because I think Locke calls the impression of touch solidity, the idea of solidity. Hume is saying solidity means the fact that bodies can't penetrate each other. Um, and that simple impression, Locke agrees that solidity is a simple idea. So that simple impression can't represent this complicated situation. Right? It's just one simple thing. It can't represent one body being unable to penetrate into another body. And moreover, like I said, Hume goes on to discuss various cases where we feel solidity, and it's obvious that that feeling doesn't show us what our hand can or can't do or whatever. So now, of course, Locke's answer to that is, it's true. The idea of solidity doesn't um, like the idea of this situation is different from the simple idea of solidity. but there's a visible necessary connection between them, right? And that was the actual, that was one of the examples he actually gave, that um, impulse presupposes solidity or something like that, right? That is the ability of one body to push another has a visible necessary connection to this other simple idea, solidity. So when we touch the body, we get the simple idea of solidity, but from that visible necessary connection, we conclude, therefore, that the body will resist our hand. Now, um, obviously, uh, Hume says there are no such visible necessary connections, and that's why this argument, which I think like wouldn't work against Locke on Locke's own premises, does work against Locke on from Hume's point of view. Okay, that's all I want to say about the modern philosophy. This is where I would stop and ask if there are questions, but since there's no one here, there's no questions. Um, or I don't know what they are. Um, I wish I could fix this. All right. Okay, so now I'm going to go on and discuss the first part of the reading for today, which is about personal identity. Um, so the right, the question about personal identity. Um, Again, remember, identity means sameness. And the question of personal identity is um, what makes a person the same person? Now, I mean, um, when Locke treated personal identity, he did it in light of his view of what identity is. Namely, as I was explaining last time, that from Locke's point of view, at least in most cases, the idea of identity is an idea of kind of fictional sameness between two things that are really different, but which are the same for some purpose from some point of view, right? So like the again the little oak sapling at one time and the big oak tree at another time, this time. So uh, these are clearly not the same. This one is big and this one is small, but they're the same oak tree, meaning that like for the purposes of oak treeness, we treat them as the same or we regard them as the same. Um, I mean, whether there's a case where Locke says, no, it really is exactly the same or not is a little bit unclear. But in most cases of identity, Locke um, doesn't think it involves anything like that. It's two things that are different, but we're treating them as the same. So, um, and so when Locke turns to personal identity, he just has to answer, like, for what purposes do we treat? Like, do we ask whether a person at one time is the same person as a person at another time? And he says we ask that for forensic purposes. That is basically for the purpose of like attaching moral responsibility so that we need to know which future person is liable to reward and punishment for the actions of this past person, right? And for that, it's fine that it's this kind of identity. Sure, they're not literally the same. A lot of things have changed, died and been resurrected in a new body, which, again, as I think I mentioned before, Thomas Aquinas says that after the resurrection, our bodies will be spherical and transparent. So, the, you know, the new person is quite different from the old person. That is the new the two things we're talking about are quite different from each other, let's say, or they might be. But it doesn't matter because for the purpose that we have the idea of person for, they're the same. But Hume, on the other hand, remember Hume's treatment of identity is that um, what's fictional in identity is not the sameness, but the difference, right? That in a true case of identity, um, that is, in a case where the idea of identity applies literally, um, what's fictional is that there's different times. So, right, there's really just one thing that doesn't change, and therefore there's no succession of time in that thing. Right? Hume says our idea of time uh, involves succession. So an unchanging thing is is all at one time. There's no succession in it. However, something else can be changing. And because the other stuff is changing, this is simultaneous with each of these in succession. That is, in this succession. Here, there's no succession, right? So as we go from one to another of these, this one is simultaneous with this, then this one, then this one, then this one. And by fiction, we divide this into temporal parts corresponding to these changes in the external object. So we think of this as having um, four different stages, just as this thing did. But then these four different stages are really just the same thing. And that's the idea of identity. It's a fictitious relation between fictitious parts of something that doesn't really have parts. So, from Hume's point of view, if we want to say that the self is identical and mean it literally, we have to mean that there's a self that doesn't change. It's always present to all of my ideas and impressions, is the way Hume puts it. And what he means by that is not that something similar is present to all my ideas and impressions. Rather, it would be just one thing. Because there's no succession in it, so it doesn't have temporal parts. So, like, if I sort of like kind of heard a certain tone completely unchanging throughout my whole life, then, like, in my idea of that tone, there would be no succession and therefore no time, no impression of time, I guess is the way he puts it. I'm not sure. Anyway, um, uh, but then I would regard it as identical. That is, I would fictionally break it up into parts corresponding to everything else that changes in me constantly. And then between all of those parts, there would be this fictional relation of identity. I mean, it's a fictional relation because a real relation, according to Hume and Locke, has to be between two things. And here there's only one thing, so there's no relation. But because we fictionally split it up into different things, we then invent this fictional relation of identity that holds between them. All right. So like that's what it would mean if we really did know ourselves as identical. And Hume starts by saying that some philosophers imagine that that actually happens. I think imagine here is being used loosely, right? He doesn't, it's not about images. It just means they believe, and he probably doesn't even think that, right? That they pretend to believe it, or they talk as if they believe it. Anyway, um, this is on page 299. It's book one, part four, chapter six, in the very first paragraph, or sorry, section six in the very first paragraph. There are some philosophers who imagine that we are every moment intimately conscious of what they call our self, that we feel its existence and its continuance in existence, and are certain, beyond the evidence of a demonstration, both of its perfect identity and simplicity. Now, I'm not sure exactly who he has in mind here. It's not Locke, that's for sure. Right? Um, um, Locke does say we have intuitive knowledge of our own existence, but he doesn't think we have intuitive knowledge of our own perfect simplicity and identity in Hume's sense. I mean, he thinks we have a memory of previous, what we count as previous phases of ourself, and they're counted as parts of the same person precisely because of that memory, right? It's memory. And remember, I tried to argue a little bit why memory is the thing that makes for accountability. It's not clear. Hopefully, I'll come back to that if I have time, because Hume brings up a similar issue. Um, but so it's not Locke. Now, I mean, he might mean Descartes, um, but I doubt if he does mean Descartes, I don't think it's accurate. I mean, Descartes in the second meditation does say, is it not the same I who thinks and imagines and et cetera, et cetera? Um, but, um, and I do think that's supposed to be certain beyond the reach of a demonstration for Descartes, but not because we feel it, right? Not because we have a feeling of ourselves as always being the same thing. It's because if we attempt to doubt it, it lands us in a contradiction, right? That's the way Descartes' whole argument works in the second meditation. So, and Hume, depending how you understand the appendix, it may be that Hume ultimately agrees with that. But in any case, like these philosophers who imagine this, probably not Descartes, not Berkeley. Berkeley does think that we know something like that, but not by means of an idea, right? So it's not something we feel again. Um, he may be thinking of someone else, or he may interpret Descartes differently than I do. That's likely. Um, um, so in any case, that's the view that he sets out to refute. The view that um, our idea of our own identity is founded on an impression of identity in the strict and literal sense. Or I guess I should say, yeah, it's a little bit complicated what he does here. The question is, I think, so the question is, do we have an idea of ourselves as simple and identical in that way? Um, in other words, can we even understand what these philosophers are saying? And Hume says no, because this is in the same place I was reading before, page 299. For from what impression could this idea be derived? Right? How could we get an idea of self as something simple and absolutely identical in every part of our life? The answer is we must get it from an impression. And that impression would have to be this simple and um, unchanging impression. And Hume says, um, Right, that's, I'm not going to open the book again, but that's basically the next sentence. If any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole of our lives. But he says there is no such impression. Um, that presumably is supposed to be empirical. And he even says maybe the person I'm arguing with does have that impression. I can't prove that they don't. Um, Although he seems to be pretty skeptical, actually, right? Because the next thing he says is something like, but leaving aside any metaphysicians of this kind, the rest of us can agree that there is no such impression, right? Meaning he doesn't really believe that these metaphysicians have a special impression that no one else has. Um, he thinks they've been confused into um, feeling like they must have such an impression, and then they invent it or claim that they feel it. Um, so Hume says, what's really going on here? Well, what's really going on here is the same usual story, and it's also how Hume will explain the tree example, right? So, like, Locke thinks nothing, there's no confusion in the tree example. We know perfectly well that regarded as a mass of matter, this is not the same as this. This is smaller, this is bigger, all the parts have changed around, etc. But at the same time, we know that regarded as a tree, it is the same. That is, we know what it is to treat something as the same tree or what it takes to count as the same tree. So, like, we're not confused about anything. We're using our ideas the way we're supposed to. But Hume's analysis of an example like this is that because the different phases of the tree are very similar to each other, right? So there's a relation of resemblance as the tree goes on. And there's also a relation of cause and effect because the later phases are like caused by the earlier ones. And there's also a further relation, which is going to turn out to be important in the case of the self, namely that it at least seems like all the phases of the tree are kind of working towards the same end, right? Like towards the continued life of the tree. So, therefore, because of those strong relations, the mind has a very strong tendency to slide easily from the early phase of the tree to the late phase of the tree. And so we have this really strong tendency to think of them as the same because that easy sliding is similar to what would have happened if there had just been one unchanging thing here. It isn't the same, but it's similar to it, right? So again, there's like two relations of resemblance. There's this one between the parts of the tree, and then there's this one between that relation and the fictitious relation of identity between the fictitious parts of this unchanging thing. And so we get them confused, and we think of the tree as literally the same. But then, if we stop and focus on any two stages that are far apart from each other, without thinking about all the relations in between, we notice that they're definitely not the same. So we're like, oh, how to deal with this? And that's where Hume thinks the ancient philosophy got started on substantial forms and other kinds of mysterious stuff, right? That there is something that was literally the same throughout this, the substantial form of the tree. And what changed was only its external forms or accidents or whatever. So that way, it's very much like what the vulgar. It's essentially the same as what the vulgar do when they think that our impressions continue even when we're not. They're not present to our mind. Um, or no, sorry, it's the same as what the philosophers do with external objects. Say, oh yeah, there's something that continued. It's just it wasn't immediately present to my mind. What immediately present to my mind was interrupted and was dependent on my mind, but there was something else that was distinct and uninterrupted, and that is the external object. So similarly here, the ancient philosophers say, well, sure enough, what I saw, what I sensed, what had effects on other things around it, um, wasn't really identical. It changed from time to time. But there was something that was identical. And that thing can't be directly seen, right? So it's like this external object, basically. That thing can't be directly seen, but it's there. It's the substantial form. So Hume says we do the same thing with ourselves. There's strong relations between our previous state and our current state, relations of resemblance, because not just because our state doesn't change that quickly, but also because our later states often contain memories of our previous states. So, by way of that, we get a resemblance, right? There's relations of cause and effect, so we think, right? I mean, we have the same kind of evidence for that as we have in the case of the tree. Just as in the tree, we have the common experience that small things like this are followed by big things like this. And so we start again, the mind slides easily from one to the other, and we start to think of this as the cause of that, like as if this there was a tie of necessity between them. Similarly, we see those patterns in our passions and ideas and whatever, and through custom, we come to think that there's a relation of cause and effect there too. So there's resemblance, cause and effect, and also um, um, there's something like this relation, this being united by a common final cause or purpose, right? Like throughout our life, our, so to speak, past self and future self work together to accomplish certain aims. And above all, like the aim of staying alive, right? Um, so, uh, so because of all those relations, we have a strong tendency to regard ourself, our inner self, so to speak. I mean, we're not talking about our body exactly, or um, we might or may not be including our body in this, I guess is the right way to put it. But we're definitely including as our ideas and impressions. They, they have this, there's these strong relations between them. We have a tendency to think that there's just one identical thing there. But again, when we actually check and compare different parts of it, we find that they're not the same. And so, uh, we go through the same thing. This Hume describes this in general on page 302. So it's still in book one, part four, section six. Yeah. However, at one instant we may consider the related succession as variable or interrupted, we are sure the next to ascribe to it a perfect identity and regard it as an invariable and uninterrupted. Our propensity to this mistake. So it's a mistake, Hume says, right? That's, I want to emphasize that because again, Locke thinks there's no mistake here. Locke thinks we're using the idea of identity correctly, but Hume thinks this is a mistake. Um, oops, I lost my place. Our propensity to this mistake is so great from the resemblance above mentioned that we fall into it, that is, this resemblance, right? The resemblance between a succession of objects that are related and a single uh, identical object. Um, We fall into it before we are aware, and though we incessantly correct ourselves by reflection and return to a more accurate method of thinking, yet we cannot long sustain our philosophy or take off this bias from the imagination. Our last resource is to yield to it and boldly assert that these different related objects are in effect the same, however interrupted and variable. In order to justify to ourselves this absurdity, we often feign some new and unintelligible principle that connects the objects together and prevents their interruption or variation. So Hume says, this is how I get the idea that I'm identical, that I'm the same self throughout my life. There's nothing really identical. There's just a bunch of impressions and ideas and whatever. Um, uh, that are related to each other in certain ways. But because they're so strongly related to each other, I fall into this mistake or absurdity of thinking that these different things are somehow the same. And then to like cover it up or like um, get rid of the unease of believing a contradiction, I invent this thing that really is simple and unchanging, and that's my, my soul or my substantial form, my individual essence, right? And that really is unchanged throughout my life. But Hume says I had no evidence for that at all. The reason I invented that was to get rid of the absurdity of my mistake. The rational thing to do would have been to realize it was a mistake and say there's just a bunch of different things. They're related, but they're not the same, right? But because I can't maintain that accurate view very long and it's very uncomfortable because I keep falling back into the mistake, instead, my last resource is to invent something that doesn't change. Um, Now, apparently, I mean, or I guess I should put it this way. So, in the body of the text, Hume says that the intellectual world is going to have an advantage over the physical world. The intellectual world, meaning, so I guess maybe I am excluding, I mean, am I excluding my body when I think this? He certainly isn't talking about my idea of the identity of my body. He's talking about my idea of the identity of my mind. Let's say it's just that, right? So the intellectual world, that is the world of ideas and impressions, um, uh, is contains a mistake that's like my view, my belief about it contains a mistake that's similar to the mistake I make about the external world. Um, but he said, but in the body of the text, Hume says, but it has this advantage at least that Um, whereas uh, the um, no matter how I think about the external world, I always get involved in some contradiction. Um, I can think about the intellectual world without any contradiction. That is, all I have to do is just stop believing in this incomprehensible thing. And I mean, why is this supposed to be? I mean, isn't it still going to be the same mistake that we'll fall into so naturally? I guess the point is not so much that, I guess the point is it's true, when I'm not thinking about it carefully, I'll go back to believing in this identity. But when I try to think accurately, I find that there's a perfectly comprehensible and contradiction-free view I can adopt. Whereas in the case of the external world, um, however, I try to think if as long as I maintain that there is an external world, I'm caught in some kind of falsehood or contradiction. I guess that's the right way to put it. But once I get rid of that and I only think about the intellectual world, then there's no contradiction. Whenever I want to think about it accurately, I just realize that there's nothing identical there, and that's the end of the story. But then in the appendix, now the appendix was appeared in the first edition of volume 3, right? So this was what we're reading is from volume 1, but volume 3 was published the next year. It wasn't like a long time in between. And with volume 3 came this appendix. And the appendix, uh, in the appendix, Hume points out certain errors that he's noticed in the previously published text. So in this edition, appendix starts on page 671. So apparently he changed his mind about this quickly. Or again, maybe this is one of his tricky things. I'm not sure, to tell you the truth. I could go either way. But in any case, so what he says in the appendix, this is on page 675. I had entertained some hopes that, however deficient our theory of the intellectual world might be, it would be free from those contradictions and absurdities which seem to attend every explication that human reason can give of the material world. But upon a more strict review of the section concerning personal identity, I find myself involved in such a labyrinth that I must confess I neither know how to correct my former opinions nor how to render them consistent. And then he basically says, this is not so bad because this is basically an argument for skepticism. If this be not a good general reason for skepticism, it is at least a sufficient one. Sorry, it is at least a sufficient one, if I were not already abundantly supplied, for me to entertain a diffidence and modesty in all my decisions. Right? He's saying, so, the moral is, as usual, don't think about it too hard. You'll get involved in contradictions. Um, so like Hume is perhaps not all that upset about this. And as I said, you can even imagine him planning out to begin with and knowing, I mean, I guess it's a little far-fetched. Why would he go to these elaborate lengths to do it? I don't know. There could be a reason, I guess. But in any case, you can imagine him planning this out in advance, knowing all the time that this was going to lead to another contradiction, but like saving that punchline for the appendix in volume three. Um, um, from from Kant's point of view, a contradiction like this is absolutely intolerable, right? Like I can't, there can't be a labyrinth that I don't know how to get out of when the question is, who am I? Am I the same person? Right? Um, so now, I would like to say something about what does Kant maybe think. So, I mean, so this is the frustrating thing about the appendix. After saying that, Hume goes through the um, supposed contradiction really quickly, and it's not clear what it is. I think I think although different Hume interpreters have different ideas about what the contradiction is, I think they all agree that Hume doesn't make it clear what it is. It's the treatment is very fast and it's hard to understand exactly what he thinks went wrong. So like moreover, when I say what's Kant's diagnosis of what went wrong, the treatise wasn't available in German and Kant didn't read the treatise, although he did have some secondhand information about what was in it. So, like, it can't be a direct reaction. Um, but um, I mean, this is essentially all that Hume says, page 677. So he basically, before page 677, at some length, he basically gives the same type of explanation he did before. We attribute a real simplicity and identity to ourselves because of this mistake, but there isn't really one there. But then he says, and this is the very bottom of page 677, the present philosophy, therefore, has so far a promising aspect. But all my hopes vanish when I come to explain the principles that unite our successive perceptions in our thought or consciousness. I cannot discover any theory which gives me satisfaction on this head. So he doesn't say what theories he tried, why they're not satisfactory, what kind of principle he's looking for. I mean, the principles that unite our ideas and impressions together are the usual principles of like resemblance, continuity, etc., right? But he's looking for something else. But he doesn't say exactly what it is and why he can't find it. Um, um, it possibly has something to do with um, why do I only remember my past experiences and not yours? Right? That's a hard question to answer. Um, yours might be just as related to mine as mine are. Might resemble them just as much. I I'm not sure if that's the start of the labyrinth or if it's something else. Since I'm so unsure what Hume means, I'm even less sure, and I don't really have time because now I realize I'm running out of time. I don't really have time to try to figure out whether it has anything to do with Kant, which you're probably grateful for because I talk about Kant too much. So okay, so there is one more thing here, namely, um, Hume, at the beginning of the section on personal identity, makes it, or near the beginning, it's actually in paragraph 5, makes a distinction which I might call, he doesn't use these terms, but a distinction between theoretical and practical identity, right? A distinction between, as he says, identity as it regards thought and imagination, which he says that's what I'm going to talk about here, and identity as it regards our passions or the concern we take in ourselves, which he says he's going to discuss elsewhere. But I don't think he ever does come back to express it, to address it. There's a note, the editors, oh no, I think that's in the other edition probably. There's no notes in the back of this one, are there? No. There's a note in the back of the other edition that I used to use that points to a particular passage in book 2 and says this is where he comes back to it. But I looked at that passage and I don't see that he says anything useful there about this problem. Right? The problem is again, like the problem is what makes me believe that what makes me care about what happens to a certain person in the future. And although he says he's not going to address that here, he it turns out that however that's to be explained, it plays an important role in our concept of personal identity in the other sense too, because remember, it was like the fact that the my parts are kind of like working together towards something that that was the strongest relation of all, right? Like that's what makes us think that a ship is the same ship, even after every board has been exchanged for a new board over time. But it's still being used for the same purpose. So we think of it as still the same. Um, and so the question of like, why is that? Why do I care what happens to future self? um, kind of has to be answered to make sense of why there's that strong feature relation. Um, Again, since Hume doesn't address it, I don't know exactly what his answer is. Um, Locke thought that it had something that Locke thought that I should care about the person who's going to remember being me, but it was unclear to me at least why that's the key factor. Um, Why does the fact that they remember being me make me want them to be rewarded and not punished? Okay, there's more to say about that, but there's only like 10 minutes left, and I want to say something about the conclusion of book 1. This always happens to me. The future is like the past again. All right. So, conclusion of book 1, that is section 7 of uh, book 1, part 4. Um, So this is the end of book 1, and therefore it's also the transition to book 2, right? So, and um, there's this dramatic story going on where we're kind of like, as I mentioned before, it's a fictional story, but it's kind of a suspenseful fictional story because the question is like, is Hume going to go on to book 2, or is Hume going to get discouraged and stop here? Now, I mean, we know, of course, that Hume is going to go on to book 2, and I think volume 1 and volume 2 were published at the same time. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, certainly we know that there's going to be volume 2 because right? We know it's not the last page of the book. So, I mean, it's similar to a type of cliffhanger you have in a fiction where, like, the narrator's not going to die because there's another 300 pages in the book, but but it's suspenseful because you don't see how they're going to survive, right? So, like, the same thing happens here. This kind of Hume narrator, right? It's not Hume the writer because Hume the writer, again, like um, by the time he revised the end of book one and sent it to the publisher, he had definitely already decided to write book two. He wasn't still going back and forth and like, just in time to finish. He decided one rather than the other. He, obviously, this is written after he already knows what he's going to do. And like whether he ever went through a process just like this is unclear and also not important because again it's a fiction. It doesn't claim to be an accurate representation of Hume's thought at some particular time. So right, but so that is, it's just like Descartes' Meditations for those who are in 100b. And I mean it's about the kind of the same topic as Descartes' Meditations. Especially, it's like the end of the first meditation and the beginning of the second meditation. Like, am I going to go find a way to go on from this skeptical doubt that I've raised for myself? But instead of a succession of arguments, of like fictional arguments here, we get a succession, I mean, fictional arguments. That's the difference between these two fictions. A fictional argument, if it's valid, can actually be used as an argument, right? So, as the meditator says, whether I'm dreaming or awake, uh, 2 plus 3 still equals 5. But here we get a sequence of fictional moods that Hume goes through. Um, that is, Hume starts off saying, and it's kind of an echo of what happened at the end of section two, right, where he said, at present I'm inclined to repose no faith at all in bodies. So similar here, at the end he says, but what am I saying that very abstruse arguments have little effect on the mind? Right now, these skeptical arguments overwhelm me. I don't know what to say. I'm thrown into a kind of melancholy. Um, and the melancholy feeds on itself and leads to a kind of delirium. So the first stage Hume calls melancholy and delirium. In this stage, I'm in no mood to either continue my previous reflections or do anything else. Right? I feel like isolated. Um, my opinions are uncouth, incommunicable. No one else would want to get involved in what's happened to me. Um, uh, I can't rest at any point. Um, I'm certainly in no shape to take up now the whole question of the passions and start book two. And Hume says, how do I get out of this? Um, I guess, I started late since no one was here, and since no one's still here, I can end late. So maybe I can give myself another 5 minutes. But so uh um how do I get out of this? Is there some argument? That's how Descartes gets out of it, right? Descartes is also, I mean, it's not exactly the same state, but it has a lot of features in common with it. Isolated, right? Like afraid to wake up because I'll find myself in prison in the dark. Um, it's a similar type of state that Descartes finds himself in, at the end of the first meditation, or Descartes' meditator, Descartes' character finds herself in at the end of the first meditation. So, but Descartes or Descartes' character gets out of it by an argument. Wait, there's something you can't doubt. You exist. Or that is, wait, there's something I can't doubt. I guess it depends whether you think of the person who's sending the letter or receiving the letter. Because I think the meditator is holding the meditations. All right, no, sorry, this isn't a course about Descartes. So back to Hume. In Hume, there's no argument like that coming. In fact, I think that's why the previous section was about personal identity, right? It's precisely to show that there isn't some uh, thing that I perceive that's myself, that I know beyond the reach of any demonstration exists, and so forth. Um, so that thing that the meditator is able to build back on has been eliminated. So no argument is going to get me out of this. Hume says, what does get me out of it? Um, After a while, I do something else that takes my mind off of this. Um, I play a game of backgammon, as examples, right? So that's why on the Canvas page, I have that image. It's supposed to be, I don't think the likeness of either of them is that great, but it's supposed to be a picture of Hume playing backgammon with Adam Smith. Right. Anyway, so like I play a game of backgammon, I take my mind off all this stuff, and when I take it up again, um, uh, my previous reflection seemed cold, strained, and ridiculous. Um, Again, this is actually something similar to what happens to Descartes' meditator. In the sixth meditation, the meditator, looking back at the whole course of the argument, says that um, um, that my doubts of the past days now seem ut risu digne, um, as deserving ridicule, laughter, right? Ridiculous. So it's the same thing. Like the Hume character is like after playing a game of backgammon and whatever else, I dine, I think is the other example, right? After having a good meal and playing a game of backgammon, he says, now what about that skepticism stuff? And it's like, how did I get that? How did I let that get me upset? Um, and therefore, two things. Number one, um, again, book two isn't going to get written because I say to myself, that was a dumb thing to try to do. I'm not going to try to do that, anything like that again. From now on, it's just eating and backgammon, right? Or writing the history of England, perhaps, right? I'm not going to think about that uh, crazy, literally like insane making stuff before that I was thinking about before. But Hume says not only that, but I remember enough of that previous state that I'm angry. I'm angry at that damn philosophy stuff from having put me in that state. So this is, Hume calls this second stage the stage of indolence and spleen, right? Spleen means anger. Indolence means like laziness. That is laziness for philosophy, not for backgammon, perhaps not for history even, but laziness for metaphysics. I'm not going to do this stuff anymore. I don't feel like it. And moreover, Hume says, I'm so angry that I want to throw all my books and papers into the fire. How does he get out of this? Again, it's a cliffhanger, right? How is he going to get out of this? tough situation. Will book two ever get written? So, so again, Hume says the answer is uh, not that I find some mistake in like my thinking about this. Um, it's just that after time, my mood changes again. I get tired, I've had it, eaten enough, I've played enough backgammon. I go for a walk, and um, and I'm naturally drawn back to thinking about these things. I want to think about them again. I've forgotten how, like how much trouble I got into last time. I mean, of course, literally forgotten, but again, it no longer has a strong influence on me. Um, I guess you could say that my indolence and spleen now seem cold, strained, and ridiculous. What was I so mad about? Okay, I couldn't work out something about skepticism, whatever. Let's think about another philosophical issue. Now we're going to start book two, right? Um, and this Hume calls the state of good humor and seriousness. So one thing that's interesting about this is there's a continuing metaphor drawn from humoral medicine, right? So I don't remember if I talked about this before in this class or not, right? But uh, uh, the tradition of Western medicine for millennia involved and as has something in common with other forms of traditional medicine like China and whatever, that the tradition was that the body is composed of four humors, or there's four humors. I don't know if it's all composed of the four humors. I think it is actually. Anyway, the body is composed of four humors, and health is a state where the humors are correctly balanced. But if the humors get out of balance, then it leads to disease. And if the humors get out of balance in a certain place, which I guess according to Aristotle would be the heart, but according to most people in that tradition of medicine is the brain. If the humors get out of balance in the brain, it leads to mental illness. So, right, so the four humors are black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. Now, I mean, there really is no such thing as black bile, I think. There's something we call bile. I think that's what they used to call yellow bile. They thought there was also something else called black bile, but there isn't. Obviously, there is such a thing as blood and phlegm. The body is not all composed of bile, blood, and phlegm. The theory is not correct. Whether Hume would have believed it or not is there were still people at this stage who took this theory seriously. Hume probably was not one of them. Right. So this is probably a kind of fanciful metaphor. Um, but it is a metaphor, right? Because this is black bile, right? That's what this part means black, and this part means bile. This is supposed to be an L, and the Latin side of N. Melancholy. Um, Yellow bile is supposed to be produced by the spleen. Bile is really produced by the liver, I guess, but that is produced by the spleen. So, right, um, and this good humor, I'm not sure that either means, maybe it means a healthy balance of all the humors, but I suspect it means rather that blood is predominating, right? So, like, this is a melancholic state where the black bile is there's too much black bile in the brain, and it makes you, as we would now say, depressed. That's number one. This is a choleric state where the temperament of the brain, that is the mixture, that's what temperament means. The temperament of humors in the brain has too much color that is yellow bile, and that makes you angry. And that's why spleen and splenetic have to do with anger. And this probably means that you have too much blood in the mixture, and that makes you sanguine, right? That's from the Latin word for blood. So you have too much blood, it makes you sanguine. That is, it makes you over optimistic. So basically, like these moods are they're like kind of like successive phases of being out of balance. Um, Again, unless this good humor is supposed to mean like the right balance. In that case, we would say that these are the unhealthy, like mad states, and this is the return of health. But I I feel like that's not what Hume means. And I know in other places he uses sanguine to describe the situation where he's setting out on a course of metaphysical thought. So um, I think what he really means is that um, for someone who, at least for someone who thinks about these issues, there's no balanced resting place. You're always a little bit out of whack. Um, all right, I'm gonna end there. Tomorrow in person, we'll discuss the beginning of the second inquiry, and I hope to see greater than zero people then. Bye.